Welcome, everybody. This is our first camp webinar of 2022. And in the house this evening, we have our beloved next door neighbor and coworker, Christine Casey. And Christine has lovingly managed the Haagan-Dazs Honeybee Haven. Oh my gosh, for I'm sure over 10 years at least now, right,
12
Christine?
years.
12 years, yes. And this evening, Christine is bringing with her a whole bunch of wisdom on how to be better gardeners for bees. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Christine, and please share your screen and impart your wisdom. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you, Wendy, and good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here and do one of my favorite things in the world, which is talking about bees and plants. Okay. All right, so I'm going to talk this evening about recent research that will really inform our bee gardens and allow us to put science to work in the garden for the benefit of bees. And this will be work done by myself and Alina, as well as other groups. So when we think about bees and plants and habitat, we generally tend to think of either agricultural settings, obviously, because of pollination, or bees in wild habitats. But in the last 20 years or so, there's been a lot of work showing that bees can be both diverse as in terms of species and abundant in numbers in urban settings. And the list I have here is just a snapshot of some of the studies that have taken place in the last 2 decades. And we take this to heart at the Honeybee Haven. We really exist to provide information and inspiration for urban bee gardeners, folks who are interested in helping bees and want to know what they can do in their gardens to be helpful to bees and to do the right things. We also do a lot of outreach to youth groups and schools, as well as to the general public, and we offer internships for undergraduate students as well. I'd like to right up front acknowledge the many organizations and individuals that support us. We don't have a dedicated source of funding. Haagan-Dazs does not provide us with ongoing support. And so the contributions of these individuals, and especially of our many volunteers, really are very valuable in keeping the garden going. So I think most of you, all of you certainly are familiar with honeybees, and most of you may be familiar with some of the other bee species out there as well. For those of you who are not, I think it's really interesting and kind of amazing to recognize that bees are tremendously diverse animals with over 20,000 species worldwide. And here in California, we have about 40% of the North American bee fauna. And I think that's a direct result of our diverse geography, which creates diverse plant material. And then of course, bee and plant diversity is completely interlinked. And unlike our honeybees that live in hives and are social, most bees are solitary. And of our native bees, 70% nest underground and then 30% above ground. And even within a small garden like the Haven, we're a ½ acre in size, we've seen quite a diversity of bees over the years. 80 species of bees have been recorded at our garden. And here you can see the largest and the smallest bee that we've seen at the Haven, the carpenter bee on the left and the sweat bee on the right. But there's still huge potential for helping our bees in terms of habitat. This is a little bit of old data, but I think still useful to make the point. This is a diagram based on satellite data from NASA showing the proportion of turfgrass area in the United States. And as you can see, a lot of it is centered around urban areas. While some turfgrass, obviously sports fields, your lawn if you have a dog or small kids, those areas of turf get used, but there are many, many areas of turf around our houses, on campus, around business parks, that nobody ever walks on unless it's getting mowed. And this is tremendous potential for habitat to help our bees, because we all know that good, healthy, diverse forage is critical for healthy bees. So I'm going to take a few minutes to start by going over the common bees that we see in our gardens, and then move into a discussion of some recent research that's showing some ideas both about maybe how to select plants for bees, how to design our gardens, and then finish up with the work that we've just completed at Davis. So of course, the most prevalent bee that we see in gardens, and certainly that most people recognize as a bee, is the honeybee. Both because of beekeepers as well as their feral colonies rather. Coming in close second, also in the family Apidae, which is the largest family within the bees, are the carpenter bees. Many people think these are bumblebees. It's easy to remember, there are no solid black bumblebees in California. So if it's a solid black bee, it's a carpenter bee. And these illustrate quite nicely the sexual dimorphism that is so common in bees, with the male and female quite different in appearance. Over on the right is the female valley carpenter bee, and the male counterpart is on the left. And of course, as you know, males don't sting, so that's why I'm able to touch that bee. And then in the center is the mountain carpenter bee female, about 3/4 the size of the valley carpenter bee. Bumblebees are also pretty common at the haven. Bumblebees tend to occur primarily in riparian areas, and we are about a mile from Poudre Creek. I saw bumblebees in my own garden in Woodland for the first time 2 years ago, and was quite impressed because I'm right in the middle of woodland surrounded by turfgrass, agapanthus, and nandina and other things that really are not bee plants. You'll also see bumblebees quite commonly, for example, in Sacramento, if you're along the American River or near any of the sloughs. Again, you'll see them because of that affinity that they have for water. And bumblebees are also social bees. So there is a queen and workers, as with the honeybees. Longhorn bees are also quite common in our urban gardens. They have a preference for plants in the sunflower family, and so you'll often see them if you grow sunflowers or echinacea or any daisy type of flower. And they get their name, as you can see in these photographs, from their very long antennae. They're quite easy to recognize once you realize how long those antennae are compared to most bees. Sweat bees are the smallest bees that we're going to see in gardens. These are maybe a quarter or even less of an inch in length. And sweat bees are a very large, diverse group. Some of them nest above ground, some below ground, and there are both social and solitary bees in this group. And then the leafcutter bees. You may never have seen the bee, but I'm sure that you've seen the leaf pieces that they have removed from plants to build their nests. And if you take a look at that photograph on the lower right, in some of those tubes that have been filled with nesting material and eggs, you can see the little bits of folds where the leaves were folded over to surround and protect those eggs. And we'll talk more about these bees later on. So now that we've had an introduction to the bees that we're most likely to see in the garden, let's go on and talk about how bees find plants and how we can put that to use in designing our gardens. There's clear color preferences. Purple, yellow, and white are most visible to bees. Bees see in a different color spectrum than we do, and these are the colors that they see best. They use color as a long-range cue. As they're flying over an area, for example, they're going to see colors. They're going to see contrast between the colors of a flower and perhaps the color of a turf area, and how saturated the color is as well. These are all important cues. And what this means for us in terms of our gardens is that diversity is going to be really helpful. Bees can quickly distinguish between different colors, say between purple and yellow, but are going to be slower to distinguish between similar colors. And then in addition to that color cue, they'll also rely on floral cues. So colors might cue them into an area to, say, if they're flying overhead, to drop down and investigate an area, but the floral cues are going to help to direct them right to the flower. Form, shape, and contrast in the environment are also important. If you stop for a minute and think about a tiny little bee and our complex, diverse environments, and they have to find, they have to navigate between cars and streets and people and bicycles and houses and walkways and trucks. And they have to navigate through all that to not only find the flower, but to find that little part in the center of the flower where they're going to be able to get the pollen and the nectar. And it's just kind of awesome when you step back for a minute and think about what they must need to do in order to find that. And so in that very complex visual landscape, one of the things that's very helpful to bees is contrast. I mentioned that before. Just as an example, green appears very dark to bees. So you can imagine that that makes a nice contrast with those flowers, which is going to be very helpful. Flowers that are attractive to bees tend to have UV absorbing centers because bees see in the ultraviolet spectrum, and UV reflecting edges. So again, that's going to help to direct them to that center of the flower where the resources are. Another thing that's important that may help bees find plants is edge structure. And by this, we're referring to the edge between two different types of areas. For example, the edge of a path, the material that you might have along a path edge, the edge of a building or the edge of a fence. And for example, a study in Great Britain found that bumblebees tend to prefer to nest along those linear gradients, say along a fence line or along the edge of a hedgerow, where there was a contrast between, say, a farm field and the hedgerow plantings. And here's some examples of some of the cues that bees use in flowers. Over on the left, you can see a honeybee approaching Texas Ranger flowers. And all those spots in the center are a nectar guide. And that is essentially like flashing runway lights to that bee saying, come in here, this is where the food is. And to give you an idea of what the bees actually see, over on the right is a flannel bush flower that is being illuminated with ultraviolet light. And you can see a flower that would appear plain yellow to us. That nectar in the center is a fluorescent blue. Again, really sending out a beacon to help those bees find exactly where they need to go. And then you can see those same nectar guides on the lupin flower on the bottom. So that's some ideas about some of the features and ways that bees navigate from, say, passing overhead to getting down into our gardens and finding the flowers. But what are the things, once they get into our garden, what are the things that they need there to ensure that they are healthy? Like all animals, bees need food, they need water, and they need shelter. And we'll take a look at each of these in more detail now. So starting, of course, with food, the most important thing. A question that I get asked a lot is, well, isn't it, it's a flower. I mean, if it's blooming, it must be good for bees, right? Aren't all flowers the same? And of course, the answer to that is no, they're not. Just as you know that the food we eat differs in nutrient value, exactly the same is the case for the flowers in our gardens and how beneficial and nutritious they are for bees. So it's really important that bees have a diverse diet, and that to keep in mind that not all pollen and nectar is equally valuable in terms of nutrition. And in the last several years, as gardening for bees has become a real topic of interest and something that garden centers and plant growers can use to promote and market their materials, many different bee plant lists have been developed. And a few years ago, a research team in Great Britain took a look at all of the lists that they could find and specifically looked at the scientific basis of the list. Why were the plants that were on there selected? And they found that that scientific reasoning for selecting one plant over another was not really clear, and that lists could vary greatly even within the same region. So what I recommend to folks if they're trying to select plants for their gardens is to try to select or find a plant list from whatever region you're looking in that comes from a reliable source. And for us here in California, the folks at UC Berkeley and the Urban Bee Lab have been looking at bees on plants for over a decade. And so their list is going to be very valuable. And likewise, our list at the Haven, it draws in part, this is the list of all the plants we have in the garden, which as a start was planted based on the work that they've done at Berkeley. And then, has been added to in the last several years with the research that we've been doing. And I try to make our list as useful as possible by including information on the water need, when the plant blooms, and what bee resource it provides. I also on our plant list have information with the sunset gardening zone. So it's useful for folks throughout the state to see if a plant will grow in their zone. And so some other things to think about when selecting flowers for the bee garden is to choose from a variety of plant families. As I just mentioned, not all pollen and nectar is created equal. And just like we need to eat a varied diet to get complete nutrition, exactly the same is true for bees. So having a variety of plant families will ensure different chemical composition to their food supply. Continuous bloom, of course, is very important. And for us in many parts of California, that means year-round bloom because our honeybees certainly and some of the bumblebee queens have already been spotted. So we do have bee activity year-round. And then different flower shapes, sizes, and colors are important as well. And because bees come in all shapes and sizes, as we saw at the beginning. And then a final consideration is to plant in drifts, plant like plants together, so that it's easier for bees to find them and to forage in them. And a study was conducted several years ago in Great Britain, similar to the work that I'll get to in a few minutes that we did here at Davis. And a couple of things really stood out from this. First of all, was that the two species they saw the most of were honeybees and bumblebees, and there was no correlation at all between the plants that were preferred by the two groups. And we saw that in our work at Davis as well. And so it's important if you want to have a diversity of bees in the garden to be sure to have a variety of plants. And some plants really stood out as being highly attractive. In this study, it was plants in the mint family, the Lamiaceae. And you'll see that as well when I get to our research results. And then even within that attractive group, a study in Spain found that certain plants were very attractive within even the most attractive group. And water is the next component that we need to have in a bee garden. I think you're all aware that your honeybees must have a water source in order to be healthy. And I think what's really interesting is that many people think when they think of water in the garden and providing water for wildlife, they think of bird baths. And we're always told we need to keep our bird baths scrupulously clean because they can harbor pathogens. And with bees, the exact opposite is the case. Bees actually prefer so-called dirty water. And this is a nice phrase. The work that first documented this was done back in the 30s. And the observation made by the scientists who published this was that at farm fields, the water that the cows defecated in was actually preferred by bees to water that was clean. And he's speculated that there was something, the presence of those cow patties in the water was somehow advantageous for bees. And in more recent years, it's been determined that the nutrients, minerals that will leach out of organic material like decaying leaves or those cow patties are really valuable as a complement to bees' nutrition, to what they get from flowers. And so the photo on the right is from my own garden, and I leave a shallow pot bottom. This is only about 1 inch deep, so it's really too shallow for birds to want to use. And I just let all the leaves and other organic material accumulate in there, and you can see the sort of scummy growth that is accumulated on the cork there, and that the bees that are drinking are actually drinking their water from that area with the organic material. Another way to provide water in the bee garden that we've used at the Haven is with a soaker hose. And you can either put that out to irrigate your crops, great, for example, in a vegetable bed, or you can do like we did and coil it up to make a flower pot. And then finally, shelter. Certainly with our honeybees, as the beekeeper, you're providing the shelter, but other bee species need to make their own nests, or even with the honeybees, they still may need shelter as they're out flying from weather extremes. And so, of course, for those brown nesting bees, they need bare ground. They can't go through turf or mulch or anything like that. Carpenter bees will use stumps or old logs to nest in. So it's good to put those in the garden if you've got them. And then finally, rock and stone crevices are important as well. Early in the season, those rocks are going to absorb sunlight, heat up faster than the air. So when bees are active early in the year, they can use that heat to help warm themselves up. And then conversely, in the heat of the summer, they can go into those cracks and crevices and get shade during the hottest part of the day. So something like a dry stone wall or a dry stream bed can be a valuable feature in the bee garden. And this is another example from my own garden. Remember, I talked about those edge effects and how they can be useful for bees in navigating through a space. And the piles that I have circled there are where ground nesting bees have excavated nests right along the margin of a path there. You can see it's bordered by small stones, or small boulders rather. And then over on the right, you can see some of those nest entrances. The larger one on the left was a longhorn bee, Savastra obliqua, and the one on the right was a smaller sweat bee. And I see these every year in my garden. And this points out not only the importance of those edge effects, but you'll notice that my walkway, I don't have any kind of pavers or cover on it really. It's just bare soil. And that's of course very valuable in terms of nesting. And then those stones, they actually, it's a little hard to see in this photo, but they actually made the nest entrance under the shade of the stone. And that's valuable for them as well. So having those stones or some kind of rock feature in the garden can be helpful. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the above ground shelter and those leaf cutter bees, because this is something that we get questions about all the time at the garden. And I think it's something that people feel like, I've got to help bees and I'm going to put all these nest boxes out. And you may have seen pictures of gardens where they've made entire fences into drilled holes in entire fences to provide habitat for these cavity nesting bees. And I think some of us have long had concerns about that, and there's some recent research that has borne those out. So first of all, these are bees that in the wild would use abandoned beetle galleries that they might find in a dead or decaying tree. And an example of those galleries is shown in the upper right. And we can mimic that habitat in our garden by providing these wooden blocks that have holes drilled in them. And so the first thing to think about when you're just selecting a house to put in your garden is to think about in the wild, they're going into trees. They're going into a woody material that's stationary. I've seen a lot of these houses sold that swing in the wind like bird houses. They're made out of a variety of materials. There's some made out of plastic. These will be used, but they're not going to be preferred. And it's also important to keep in mind that they will use a cavity. They don't excavate their own cavity. They have to find an existing one, and they will only use them if they correspond to the body size diameter. So a good rule of thumb in this part of the world is 3, 4, and 5/16 of an inch in diameter. And as I mentioned, a lot of people, they want to do something. They want to be helpful. They want to help bees. So they put in these entire walls or fences of bee houses, or they put in these bee condos that have hundreds of nest boxes in them. And I think as entomologists, we've long had a concern about this because it's not how they nest in the wild. The bees that are nesting in the wild, you might only have a couple of nests in an entire tree. And anytime you get that concentration of organisms together, the chance of disease spread increases. And a study was recently completed by a group in Canada that looked at this question. And they looked at 600 of these bee hotels in different areas of the city of Toronto. And they studied them for 3 years. And a couple of things I think are interesting in their findings. Native wasps were more abundant than bees and used about 75% of the blocks each year. And we've seen that at the Haven as well. We've had to take down some of our bee cavity nesting bee structures because they were overtaken by wasps. About half the bee species that they observed were introduced. And the larger the bee hotel, the higher the rate of parasitism. So these are all concerns. We certainly are not saying to not use these, but just use them judiciously. There's no need to have hundreds in your garden. Just a couple of bee houses is fine. They're great fun to watch. They do provide some benefit if they're used in the right way. And then interestingly, they also found that the areas that they studied within the city ranged from more residential to more densely populated to highly urbanized. And there was a definite connection in the number of native bee species, in that the most residential or the least dense area tended to have the most native bee species. And so, as I mentioned, when the Haven was created, I wasn't there for the first year and a half or so. And right at its creation, these bee hotels were put in. And as I became aware not only of this work, but also of the large number of wasps that were using them, I took these down. So those of you who may have been visiting the Haven over a number of years and wondered where they went, that's what happened. The other thing to keep in mind is that many of our plants have hollow stems. And, when we think about nesting blocks for bees, we humans tend to look at everything from our perspective. And we think these blocks have to be horizontal, just, as a way that we would be looking in them. But bees think in all dimensions. They travel in all dimensions. And so plant stems sticking out of the ground that are hollow will be used for nesting as well. So probably the best example of a plant you might have in your bee garden is the autumn joy sedum. And this plant has hollow stems. So when you prune this back in the fall, don't cut it all the way to the ground. Leave about 6 inches of stem, so that if you do have bees in your garden that might want to use these, they are available for nesting. So I'm going to finish up now by talking about the work that we've done at Davis. As I mentioned, UC Berkeley folks have been studying bees in gardens for nearly 20 years now. And the folks at Berkeley, in collaboration with the late Robin Thorpe at UC Davis, did that work and published this excellent book about bees in gardens for Californians called California Bees in Blooms. And the work that we did expanded on their studies to look specifically at plants that we knew were both attractive to bees and grew well in California and were popular in California, because I think there's a tendency of, some of us avid gardeners will go anywhere for an interesting new plant, but most people just want to buy something that they know is going to grow. So we tried to look more at plants that were readily available and that would grow easily in California gardens. And we evaluated the preference of bees for plants in 2 groups, either honeybees or other bees. Again, because I think most folks, we didn't really have the resources to differentiate between all the species in the way that we sampled. And I think most people are just interested in knowing that a broad range of bees are going to be coming to their garden. So this work was funded by the USDA, and we were part of a nationwide group that participated in this study. And here at UC Davis, it was myself and Alina Nino, who were the investigators on this project. And we did this both in replicated field plots that you see on the upper left, where we had 5 replications of 15 common plants. And then we also sampled in the Haven as well, which you see on the upper right. And this project took place over 4 years. And we were fortunate to be able to train a number of students that you see down there on the bottom. And then in addition to the students, the 4 pictures on the left, we had a citizen science volunteer who was a retired botanist, and that's Betty, who you see on the right, who did a lot of the sampling as well. And then Andrea, who was our most recent intern, was a landscape architecture student. And she's graduated and gone on to work for Caltrans, and she has prepared some planting plans based on the outcome of this research that I'll talk about in just a minute. So there's 2 different ways that you can sample bees. The more traditional way is with a timed count. And this is typically 3 to 5 minutes, where you make 1 observation per day of a particular plant. And we find with this kind of study that the first minute of sampling can essentially be lost due to movement of the observer between plants. Because if you're sampling for that long, you're typically bringing a chair with you, and you have equipment that you might be carrying. Another method that's been used, we used it in our studies in Davis. One of the other collaborators in the USDA study used it, and it's been used in Great Britain as well, is called a snapshot count. And this is a much faster observation of the plant. And what this allows you to do is make many observations in a day. And by counting at different times of the day, you get a better sense of the different bee species that might occur. Because some of those bigger, more robust bees, like the bumblebees and the carpenter bees, are going to come out earlier when it's cooler, whereas the small sweat bees may not start to become active till about 11 in the morning. And if you're doing a timed count, you might completely miss those bees. So that's a benefit to the snapshot method. Some other things to think about that we included in our sampling, and if you're going to be doing bee observations yourself, we only sampled when the plant was in full bloom, and we only sampled in full sun. The bee was only counted if it actually came into contact with the reproductive parts of the plant, which meant that it was actually making a contact to collect pollen or nectar. And then bees were only counted once when they arrived at a plant. And to give you an idea, these are the plants that we looked at in the field plot experiments. We looked at over 30 different plants in the garden, so I'm not going to go through all of those. And what I'd like you to look at here is not to necessarily capture each scientific name, but is to get an idea of get a sense of the different plant families that we used and the different sizes and shapes of plants that we looked at as well. So we used the Asteraceae, the sunflower family, the autumn joy sedum. Of course, we had many different plants in the mint family. Gaura is a plant that doesn't really look like it should be a bee plant. We included that in our study because it grows so well here. Our native buckwheats, the Eriogonums, the Scrophulariaceae, those nice tubular flowers that are attractive to those larger bees, and then finally verbena. And this chart shows the results in the field plot, and hopefully you all got, I provided these to Wendy ahead of time so that you'd have a chance to look at them in advance, or to have a copy there in front of you, because I know sometimes looking at these graphs can be kind of overwhelming. There's so many different numbers on here. Trying to make sense of it all can be a little challenging. A couple of things though to point out. So this is on the left-hand side is looking at the average honeybees per minute. And then over on the right is those other bees per minute. And then each line is the same plant going all the way across. And a couple of things that I'd like you to notice here is that we did our study over several years, thinking that there would be variation from year to year. But certainly with the honeybees, things were pretty consistent. For example, if you look down at the bottom of the honeybee list, the Teucrium, that was first or second in the 3 years. The Perovskia, the Russian sage, third, second, or first. The catmint, Nepeta, second, third, or fourth. So things were pretty consistent with the honeybees. Taking a look at the other bees, things were a little less consistent, with the exception, of course, of Symphyiotrichum, the asters, which were first in all 3 years that we evaluated this, but a little bit more variation within the other bees. And then in the garden, pretty similar patterns. And as I mentioned, we looked at over 30 different plants in the garden. I've tried to represent here the ones that were the most attractive. And again, we see pretty consistent, although a little bit more variation from year to year than in the field plot. And I think this is simply due to the fact that we have over 200 plants in the different plant species in the haven. So the bees just had a lot more to choose from in year to year. Some other things that I think it's important to consider and to know about, again, for helping you to design your own garden, are things like flower shape and size. And here you can see some really substantial differences with flower shape between the flat open flowers like a sunflower and the tubular flowers like the penstemon that you see here. You can see in the graph on the right, there's strong differences in the preference of different bees for those different shaped flowers. And then likewise with the flower size as well, some considerable differences between the two. So things to, again, some ideas to keep in mind as you're thinking about selecting plants for your own garden. And then the final thing I wanted to mention, and I'd love to hear all of your feedback on this. The field plot was located in one of the research plot areas of campus. And it was located, as you can see from my map here, about 1,500 feet in a straight line from some of the department beehives. And over on the right, there was highway. Up to the north, you can see was animal barns. And then to the directly south of the hive, west of the field plot, was orchards, so something that's not blooming year round. And what we notice when you look at the number of honeybees in particular each year, how each year we just saw many, many more honeybees than the year before. And the only thing I can think of to explain this is that those bees were learning where the field plot was, and that they were then returning there in greater numbers rather than making their foraging trips in all directions from those hives. They were learning that the direction where our field plot was going to be the most productive trip. And when I'm finished, when we open up for questions, I'd love to hear everyone's feedback on that idea. And then now that this project is finished, we're putting together resources, of course, to educate folks about what we found. And the approach that I'm taking is the idea of maximum bees per gallon. What are the plants that are going to be most attractive to bees and use the least water in the garden? Because, you know, these are I think the two things that most California gardeners really want to achieve. And so we've developed educational materials, signage, et cetera, around that idea to help people, you know, as they're starting or expanding gardens. These are the plants that will really give you the most bang for your limited water. And then, as I mentioned, Andrea put together some planting plans based on the results of this project. We have a low water plan and a best plant for bees plan, the one that includes the plants that were on the top of our attractiveness. And these are available for download on our website. And there's both a planting diagram as well as a list of plants. And I just want to go on and finish up with some of the next steps that we'll be pursuing to put this to work and to expand our looking at these questions about what plants are going to be best for bees. We currently have funding from the California Department of Food and Agriculture to take this information into the nursery industry, to evaluate those timed versus snapshot counts to see what works best in a nursery. And so the growers, as they introduce new plants to the market, can quickly evaluate to see what's going to be most attractive for bees. That will allow them to both market them effectively and to also, for example, if they've got to make pesticide decisions and to the ones that are going to be most attractive to bees, to be cautious with the pesticides that they use on those plants. And then we're also with the same group that did the project on bee attractiveness, we are submitting another proposal to the USDA to continue that work, to look at a little bit more detail about the ecology and the behavior of bees in these urban environments. So now that we know the plants they prefer, can we plant them in certain patterns to be more attractive? Should we target blooms with certain resources for certain times of the year? For those of us here in the West, if we cut back on watering, how does that affect nectar? So these are some of the questions that we're hoping to be answering if we get this next round of funding. And then finally, I just want to mention a crowdfund campaign that we're doing this February. I think many of you are familiar with the crowdfund campaign that the Master Beekeeper program did last year. We're doing something this year, not to bring money to us per se, but this is something, as I was telling Wendy before we started, this is something that is really important to me. not only that children get education about science and bees and nature, but that all kids have the opportunity for this. And it's always bothered me at the Haven that the schools that are able to come visit us are the schools from the communities that have the most resources. And that, so what I'm doing is running this crowdfund during the month of February to provide a scholarship program for teachers at Title I schools. These are the schools that have a majority of students on free or reduced lunch programs. And in addition to covering the transportation and admission costs, we would provide resources to the school library. And I'm hoping to raise $3,000 to fund 3 schools, and that by documenting the success of this, we can then go on and approach donors who might want to provide a permanent endowment for this project. And so that starts next week, and you can find it at crowdfund.ucdavis.edu. And then finally, I'll just mention the Haven website, the beegarden.ucdavis. And there you'll find links to our social media as well as to our blog, where I write about topics on bees and gardens. So that is the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing, and I guess, Wendy, we can open it up for questions.
Yeah, thank you. So many valuable resources you were able to bring to our program this evening. And it's great too that you're able to put a call out for funding to support education of folks who might otherwise not get the opportunity. So we've included that.
How many budding entomologists or beekeepers are there that,
exactly.
But for the exposure to this, might never know that it's a career option.
Yeah. Yes.
And
yeah. And that's one of our favorite things when we've gone into the Haven and done this. The kids come in and see themselves as entomologists. They at 7 and 8, 9 years old are at university already, right? So it's exciting.
I always I make it a point to introduce myself to them as Dr. Casey, because I want them to see that they are important enough that a doctor, is speaking to them. And I think that's an important message as well.
Yes, agreed. So there are a couple of
I see that. Let me open up the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just go through these questions. So the question about the holes being drilled, I assume you're talking about drilling holes in a wooden block. And the question was, should they be drilled at an upward angle? I'm not sure if the angle really matters. I drill them straight in just because it's easier. But as I mentioned with I think if you want to drill them at an angle, go ahead. The only thing to keep in mind is if the bee can see any light in that hole, they won't use it. So if you're drilling at an angle, you might accidentally go through the side of your block. But otherwise, I don't really think it matters. And the next question was about competition between native bees and honeybees. And certainly this is an area that is becoming more, there have been some studies that have raised some concerns about competition between native bees and honeybees. And I think this is going to be really situation dependent. The Haven has so many plants that I've never seen. I mean, I think if you think back to that picture I showed you of a sunflower, there were 4 different bee species on there. So in a garden like the Haven, this is not an issue, but I think this just speaks to the need to fill our gardens with the right flowers, so that there's plenty for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Trish had an interesting little thing happen. She's seeing this greenish nectar being stored in honey supers right now, and she's in San Clemente, and she's been researching plants there, but cannot really locate something that has greenish fluorescent type nectar. And she can't imagine they would be on antifreeze, considering this is an area where they don't use it. But you never know. Some individuals could have gone up to the mountain skiing this winter and might have dumped it. What are your thoughts on that, Christine?
I have absolutely no
Yeah.
idea.
Yes. Stranger things have happened, I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's amazing. We don't know what people are dumping here, there, and everywhere.
Mhm.
Yeah, it might be interesting if you could just to capture some of that and
Yeah,
just,
photos would be really helpful.
yeah. Mhm.
If you can get those to Wendy, I can take a look at them.
Yeah, yeah, that would be awesome. Thank you, Trish. Appreciate that. And then, of course, Denise, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Hey.
Hi, Christine.
Hey.
I'm doing a research project on pollen collection and analysis, and I've been reading up about all the different sexes of the plants, and I'm understanding that they can be a perfect plant that would have both male and female parts. That would be both your stamen and pistils. I believe that's true. And then there's some dioecious trees that I'm actually collecting pollen off of, whereas certain species such as African sumac, they either have male trees that are, their flowers are producing pollen, or they have female trees. Now, I'm just curious, I've read in a different source that was saying that if it's a dioecious plant and it's only producing, say it's a male plant producing pollen, that it does not offer a nectar reward, or is there nectaries still on these male only plants?
I think that's going to be plant specific. I don't think, plants are so diverse. I don't think you can really make that general of a statement. I mean, there still would be an advantage to the, because the plants that have separate male and female parts are going to be more reliant on bees for pollination. So it would certainly make sense that they would have nectaries to attract bees.
Because I'm curious, because the bees are all over the trees gathering their pollen on this male only tree. So in other words, they're not really going over to the female trees that I know of, because there are only, bees will usually only collect either nectar or pollen, and there's only a little percentage maybe that are going to go out and collect both. So that's where my question is. I'm wondering, I know that the bees know that they need to go out and collect pollen to bring it back to their colonies, but they're not necessarily getting a nectar reward for that specific just pollen collection.
No, but if the female needs to have a reason for those bees to visit her. So if the female would produce nectar so that they would, when they go in for the nectar reward, if they still had pollen, because they'll drink nectar when they're out on a foraging trip. They'll stop to drink nectar because they need the energy. So you'll have a bee. You'll see bees all the time with full loads of pollen on plants that are only providing nectar because they're stopping to get that resource.
Okay, because I was wondering then, how do those plants reproduce if there's, because I was in a grove with the African sumac and I was collecting pollen off of like 3 or 4 different male only trees, but then there were some female trees that had some pods on them, but I wasn't seeing really much bee activity on those trees because the bees were going crazy for all the pollen because it had just bloomed. So I'm wondering, what's getting those bees that are collecting all that pollen over to the female tree, and does the female tree have to be blooming at the same time as the male tree in order for it to be insect pollinated, or otherwise I know that there is the wind pollination that occurs.
Yeah, so if they're bee pollinated, well, if they're pollinated anyway, they have to be blooming at the same time. But yeah, it's possible that that's a plant that's wind pollinated. I'm not familiar with sumac pollination, so I can't really say one way or the other.
Yeah, somebody chimed in, Green said can be wind pollinated for sure. So that is it's a great answer. Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent questions. Thank you. Elizabeth is asking if there's any noted difference in between the attractiveness, native versus non-native?
Yeah, so that's another one of these very well studied but still unsettled questions. There have been many, there have been studies that show that native bees do best on native plants, but there are also many studies showing that gardens that have a mix of native and non-native will have more bees, because those non-native plants are blooming at times of the year when the natives may not be. So certainly, at least in terms of attractiveness, having a mix of native and non-native can be valuable. There hasn't really been enough work done specifically exposing native bees to native versus non-native pollen or nectar sources to determine what the impact is on their health. Because just because they're foraging on a plant doesn't necessarily mean that it's the healthiest. In general, bees will choose the plants when they have a choice of many plants. They'll choose the one that is the most nutritious. But if they don't have a lot of choice, they'll go to what's ever blooming. So if the only place you had to get food was McDonald's, you'd eat at McDonald's. But if you had a choice of going to the farmer's market and McDonald's, you'd probably choose the farmer's market. So,
Yeah.
But that is something, different studies have had very different results. And that, again, as I mentioned, that's something we'd like to look at in more detail if we do get this next round of funding from the USDA.
Is there anyone looking specifically at, like, I'm thinking it kind of in terms of like the competition, like, honeybees being imported and a lot of plant species being imported. Like, are they more attracted to the species that they sort of like ancestrally would have been exposed to before brought to the U.S. and like having
Well, yeah, I'll mention,
if
you think back to the
pressure on native bees.
Yeah, if you think back to the results I showed from our study, that the Teucrium and the Nepeta that were very attractive to honeybees, those are native plants for honeybees. They're from the Mediterranean region. So there may be something to that.
Great questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Does anyone have any thoughts on my idea that the bees were learning where our plot was, and that's why we were seeing more every year?
I think so. I think you're bang on in terms of that suggestion. Yes.
So Pete asks if there's been a study on the area that's needed to support a single hive. And Eric Musson supposedly did this several years ago and said that you need an acre of forage for a hive. I have no idea. I don't think he published that. I'm not sure how he determined that, but that's the story we use at UC Davis.
Yeah, until it's proven different, right?
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Oh, Pamela, have an old-fashioned bathtub around 70 feet from the hives, and it's filled with tap water, mosquito fish, buckwheat straw. Also has a circulating pump, and I add pond tabs along with Himalayan salt once a month. And in the summer, I have an abundance of water hydrangea in the tub. Is there anything else I can add in the winter to attract bees after the water hydrangeas die off?
Well, I don't know how you all can tell me this. I don't know how much water bees really need in the winter. I never see them in water sources in the winter. I've always assumed that they were able to get enough from whatever they're foraging on.
And I would venture to guess it's geographic as well, right?
Yeah. So certainly one thing you can do when you have a large water supply like that is floating corks. Just because they'll perch on the cork and drink the water. Just if you have a dog, you don't want to do that because they could choke if they drink from the tub as well.
That's good advice, Christine.
Yeah. And then as Brad said, they use that algae.
Yeah, to perch so they don't. So they don't drown.
They won't stand in water, but
Yeah. Yeah. And something else that I learned from a couple of beekeepers last summer, they went to the co-op, bought those chicken feeders, the water feeders that you
Yeah,
put
I've seen
in.
those being used. Yeah.
Yeah. And just fill it with pool water, hang it in a tree,
Mhm.
train the bees to go to that as opposed to
Yeah.
drowning themselves in your neighbor's
In the
pool.
pool. Yeah.
Yeah. So
The,
came in
the other
handy.
thing that might work in a large tub like your bathtub is I have one of these little solar fountains. You know, they're about the size of a CD, and they just float in the pond. And you know, they stop working after about 2 months, but you know, they keep floating, and so that would be something that bees might perch on as well.
Yeah, and Pamela states that they do like some water in the winter. Of course, it's their HVAC system, plus they,
Yeah.
like anything, they need water, right? So she's got that small bird bath that they tend to visit in the winter. And then Elizabeth mentioned that if you have,
Yeah, that's a good idea.
yeah,
Put them all
toothpicks,
together.
yeah, you can make little rafts.
Mhm.
That's great.
Or as I showed you with that soaker hose, that was really attractive.
Yes.
Really attractive. And you can put it on a timer so that it runs just for the hottest part of the day,
Yeah.
you know, so you're not using all that water.
Yeah.
But that works really well for us at the garden.
Do you have plans for that on your website, Christine?
I think I did a blog post about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Terrific. That's great. So folks are going to try corks in the solar fountain as well, which is great. Any other questions or comments? Any comments around Christine's thoughts around why those bees increased over the 3 years? What do you think? Anybody have an answer or a suggestion to that? Why honeybees were steadily increasing their visiting to that plot?
Like Pamela.
Actually, I don't have the answer. I have another
Oh.
question for
Oh.
you. If I can just digress, going back to my big old bathtub, I've noticed in the past month, it looks like I have freshwater, very tiny conch shells that are attaching themselves to the side of the tub. Do you know anything about them? They're black and they're about maybe a quarter of an inch high or wide, and they don't bother the mosquito fish, but they just seem to be growing. And so I've been taking them out. And do you know anything about?
I know absolutely nothing, but I do know that there are some invasive snails here in California. Where are you located?
Southern California,
Yeah.
Orange County.
Orange County?
Yeah.
Yeah, there have been some problems down there with various invasive snail species. So you might want to contact Cooperative Extension
Okay.
and see if they can link you up with someone who can identify them, just to be safe.
Okay.
I'm not sure where they would have come from. You know, generally they're carried on nursery material. But how they would show up in your bathtub, I'm not sure.
The only nursery material would be the water hydrangeas, which are now pretty much dead.
Well, they would come in, you know, in a pot. Well, if you brought something in a pot and had just planted something, they might have been in there.
Yeah, that's the water hydrangeas and
Okay, yeah.
lilies. The
Yeah,
water lilies came in
I would
dirt.
try to get them identified just to be safe.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks for that, Pamela.
and
We'll
I'm
look
sorry,
out.
I don't mean to dominate, but Christine, I was wondering how often I should clean that. I mean, it is a big old cast iron bathtub, and I do clean it out from time to time, but listening to your lecture, it sounds like I should not do that. I should just.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got
Wow.
mosquito fish,
Mhm.
yeah, and how deep is it?
It's about 2.5 feet deep.
Yeah, I would treat it like a small pond. I don't think you need to clean it out.
Ah, there you go.
Unless something gets really out of balance.
How would I know that? I guess if the mosquito fish were
'Cause
dead, I would know that.
You know, you would see something, yeah, you'd see all the mosquito fish dying, or I would imagine that water hyacinth gets pretty prolific.
It does in the summer, but in the
Yeah, you might
winter,
need to
they die
occasionally
off.
pull clumps of that out.
Yeah, and Corinne's
Um,
suggesting you can test your water on a regular too, right? That might
Mhm.
save you some time and perhaps water resources as well. What a great question.
Good
And
idea.
you
Thank
get
you.
time back, which is something that we all love, right? And just before we end, we've got some more comments in the chat regarding bee visitation. So Gina's thought is interesting too, Christine, because, pollination.
Yeah, but there aren't really any, I mean, the hives in this area would all be the hives that are on campus.
But they sometimes go and come back too, right? And
Yeah, but I mean, the number of hives at that spot was pretty consistent. I think it was
right,
about a dozen.
right.
And there really isn't any place else, I don't think, that people would be bringing hives.
Never
Um,
know. There's everybody's vying for
Yeah.
a bit of elbow room these days, right?
Yeah.
And
Because I mean, there's so much of the land around there is campus land.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
not like it's private land where somebody might be storing hives.
Yeah, but
Um,
there are a couple of commercial beekeepers close by
Yeah,
relatively, so
yeah.
you never know.
Yeah,
Very, very cool. Yeah, any hives in a 5-mile radius, basically, right? Yeah.
yeah, except I think 5 miles from there is pretty much all campus land.
Huh.
Our
Yeah.
campus is huge.
Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
physically the largest UC campus because of all those field plots.
Yeah.
Go
but-
Aggies. I'm an alumnus. I know how big it is.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for your valuable time and insight and educating us on what's going on at the Haven, invitation to help out,
I'm
giving
just
us
so
the
happy we had so much
resources.
rain.
Yes, we all are. We all are. And it's always a pleasure to be in one of your classrooms, Christine.
Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate you and we thank you very much for your time this evening on behalf of the camp. Have a great evening. Be well,
Yeah.
everyone.